Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. As always, IFA continues to bring you these IFA coronavirus updates, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day. We have an excellent group for you today, excellent panelists. We have David Barr, chairman of PMTD Restaurants, among other things. He's a franchisee of Taco Bell and KFC, and he's also the immediate past chairman IFA Board of Directors. And then we also have John Tezza. He's the principal at NRD Capital, and he's also on IFA's Foundation Board of Trustees. And we also have Charlie Chase, president and CEO of First Service Brands, and he's the first vice chair of IFA's Board of Directors. One thing I want to mention before we get started, today is also Great American Takeout. So please support all of your local restaurants, but of course I'm biased to franchising, so please make sure you support your local franchises as well. So on that note, I'm going to turn things over to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone. We know these are trying times. Appreciate you taking a moment that we might be able to share with you. We have quite a bit of Q&A, I believe, at the end of this. We're here to help you. We recognize that there are a variety of different brands on the call today, and they come with a variety of different issues. Some brands are actually operating. Some are operating at a portion of capacity. Some are not operating at all. And we recognize that. We view this as franchising as a large family, and IFA being the standard bearer for that family. We come to you with the hopes of providing good content. So with that, I'm just going to jump in. We have, of course, myself, Charlie Chase, and John Tezza, as Paul Rocchio just mentioned. Each of us are going to give about a 7-minute chat, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from there. I am presuming that everyone can see my screen. And I'm going to look at John Tezza as a nod if he can. And with that, I will advance to the first slide here. And what I thought I'd do is just briefly talk about what we should be thinking about today. And then my next slide's about what should we be thinking about tomorrow. And again, I'm going to roll through this fairly quickly. I work, as Paul mentioned, in a variety of different capacities. One that I'm very proud of is being the managing director of Franworth. I do so with John Rocci, my partner, and Dave Kyle, the president of Franworth. We help emerging brands develop and expand and achieve the entrepreneur's dreams. With that, have an opportunity to work with a lot of emerging brands. So I'm going to speak briefly as I talk about cash flows for franchisors. You know, obviously this business, we have a range of franchisors who might today have only had 20 franchisees and was just beginning to hit their stride, all the way up to a Yum Brands, right? But I think, and as a result, there's a different ways in which you look at these cash flows. I think there are a variety of businesses that are emerging that I worry about today, and I'm going to speak to you specifically, and that is around royalties. So I've talked to many businesses that they say, well, our franchisees are down 20%. So I'm estimating my royalties will be down 20%. I think people have to be careful in that regard as franchisors to assess what is the viability of those franchisees if they're down 20%, down 50%, down 70%. And what is their capacity to pay royalties? And I say that because I think it's cash flow projections for franchisors. What I am recommending to every emerging brand I'm working with is to be sure they have cash flows up to August or September, assuming almost no royalties. And that's not that we're advocating at all that royalties wouldn't be paid. I'm suggesting that we don't know how deep and long this is going to be. And having worked with distressed companies in the past, oftentimes the cash flow planning was never done on the front end. So I'm a big believer that you got to think through, how am I going to survive till August, September if this continues? Do I believe we'll stay in this state till August or September? I actually don't. But what I don't want someone to do is run out of cash when they get to the 95-yard line. So please look at that. Please understand what is the viability of your franchisees to actually pay the royalties, and what are you going to do to maintain your system. This is about survival and getting to the other side of this disaster. So as you do that, one is you have revenue from royalties, right? And I'm assuming initial franchise fees have really dried up. There might be a few brands that that's not the case, but generally they have. And then you look at your expenses. And of course, you got to assess your personnel. I think you got to assess, are you going to continue to spend money during this period of time on franchise development? What money are you spending around training, and what money are you spending on marketing? Again, this is all based upon where your system is. You have a system that's doing 80% to 100% of its pre-COVID-19 revenue, then obviously you should be spending. If you're doing 10% or zero, these are areas that I think you should assess as a franchisor. So that is an internal look. I think just as importantly, though, is an external look. Your brand, if you're franchise dominant, your brand today is about the franchisees. And how do you assist the franchisees in remaining viable? Some of these businesses, and at Franworth, unfortunately, we've gotten a real kick in the gut. I mean, we operate with a lot of health and beauty brands, and salons and gyms and other things have been shut down generally by the governments. But we still have to take a look at how do we assist franchisees in remaining viable. That might be their contract reviews, anything from reaching out to landlords to what's the music inside, and how do we abate certain contracts and work with our franchisees as they work with those individuals or other contract providers. But we do need to look at the liquidity of the franchisees. One of the other areas to consider is how do you take your team as a franchisor and work with the franchisees in getting that liquidity? There's two programs that are going to be forthcoming. One's already out there, it's the SBA disaster loans. You can go on the SBA website, connect your franchisees with that. There's loans there up to $2 million based upon current needs from a liquidity standpoint. And then today, as many of y'all know, and I just glanced over TV, but many of you know that Congress is debating what is to be called the CARES Act, which is the Coronavirus Rescue Act. Within there's going to be loans, and IFA has worked really diligently in making sure that there's certain language that allows for multi-unit franchisees to be included, even if they're above the typical SBA definition of small business, but that franchisees can apply for effectively a small business 7A loan with some extreme modifications to it. That loan will be provided fairly quickly, which will provide liquidity. There will then be a second step of loan forgiveness. The loan will be bigger than the loan forgiveness. So you can get up to 250% of your average payroll for the last approximately 3 months. And then they're going to come back subsequently. And if you maintained employment of people, you can then get loan forgiveness. So in essence, that loan turns to equity. But whether the loan gets forgiven or not, I'm recommending that franchisees that have been impacted by this should be applying for disaster loan or the CARES loans. You cannot take money from both. That doesn't mean you can't apply to both, but you should be looking to help your franchisees with liquidity. So that's just briefly about what we should think about today. I think just as importantly as you have a team around you and we're not running at full capacity, we should be thinking about what's tomorrow. So what is your brand in the future? I would suggest that coronavirus is going to change some brands forever. If you could think of a bar business, not that we have a lot of those in franchising, but we do have some. How quickly does that customer come back versus maybe even a gym? And if we're in the gym business, how do we assure further cleanliness and sterilization? And what does the customer's expectation of that be in the future? Those are just two examples, but each of you has a unique brand. I would suggest you need to think about what's that brand in the new world, and how can you begin changing it now? And how do you communicate with your customers now? There's many closed places. I know at Franworth, we're assisting our entrepreneurial founders in staying connected to their consumers. We do that through digital means. But many of these brands, if you think of gyms or salons, they're a family in their own right. And how do you take that family that's offline and not connected to the brand today, and how do you keep it connected to the brand? And we've done that through charity work or other motivational ways in which we try to make sure that people are connected to the brand. So we're doing that at Franworth. Hopefully you're able to do that as well. And it's all about staying relevant. And then finally, what can your team work on now that's for the future? How might franchise assistance change? I think in this day and age where we're doing so much through Zoom, I might suggest that our franchisees, as well as us as franchisors, might start becoming more comfortable doing things in a more digital way. So how can you set up your franchise business coaches to do that better tomorrow than they do today, so that when we relaunch, that's an effective way to do it? How does your marketing change? And as a result of your marketing changing, what can your team work on now? What reopening and grand opening can they be doing today so that when this hits, that you're ready to go? And I say that as much about how do you build your team. This is a difficult time, and I think many places have had to make some difficult cuts. And I think you now have a team around you as a franchisor. And how do you take that team and truly begin looking to the future and growth? And I think that alone helps bring people back together versus what we've had to go through over the last 2 to 3 weeks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and then we'll wrap up with Charlie. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, similar to the way that David is approaching it with his businesses, we really approach this in a multi-phase, with a multi-phase approach as well. The reality is that this is an asymmetrical impact, right? There's an asymmetrical impact of this crisis. Not every system is down. Some systems are actually up right now. Not every geography has been impacted the same way. And so, you know, really understanding how it's going to impact, you know, each of your individual brands is really important. We are taking, you know, we have brands that are completely shut down from a revenue perspective right now. Family entertainment, where either through local mandate or because of you know, our decision for what's best for the consumer, we've chosen not to be in operation. And we have other brands, we have restaurant brands that have completely pivoted on their order modality and are actually doing fairly well. We've taken a uniform approach to our planning, right? Phase one on this is emergency planning, you know, really triage planning around cash preservation and reducing, taking a very clear-eyed approach to what revenue expectations can be over the short run, and then putting a cash or an expense model in place that allows us to extend our available cash as best we can. We have businesses that are in a very good position from a cash perspective. We have businesses that are not. And so it's really all about extending our runway the best that we can. And hopefully many of you are through that initial phase. We got through that phase fairly quickly. All of our emergency plans have been approved by our board of directors. And we're well into our second phase now, which is really the execution of those plans. You know, tough decisions from a personnel perspective. We did everything we could to maintain continuity from an employment standpoint. We want to keep as many of our people employed as possible. In some cases, we've had to make some tough decisions in certain portfolio companies, but our management teams are well on their way to executing on those plans. We've set up a management cadence whereby we're meeting with our management teams on a weekly basis with a very set agenda around cash preservation and short-term execution. We kicked that off actually this morning. We will have those calls weekly moving forward. And hopefully by the end of this week, we're through the initial execution phase of that short-term planning, and we're well into phase 3, which is how are we going to optimize for this short-term reality. We've got a responsibility, our management teams, us, our entire teams, we put some significant downside planning in place, and it's now our job to go serve our guests and serve our employees in a manner that allows us to actually beat those downside forecasts and continue to extend our cash position. So we're well into our phase 3 now, which is really about how do we optimize, or how do we beat those expectations. So like I said, we've got businesses that are pivoting hard on modalities. Our businesses that are open, we're asking them to pivot hard on modalities. So in restaurants, that means expanding off-premise modalities. So we're fortunate that we have a business that has a drive-through for every one of the units. We're really deploying all of our resources against the drive-through there. We have other businesses that we've rolled out catering. We've rolled out third-party delivery very, very quickly. Third-party really didn't exist in that system, and we've really been able to leverage that modality quickly. That's the kind of thinking that we're encouraging all franchisors to consider. If there's a way for you to safely serve your community, even if it is asking you to completely turn your current operating model on its head, we're encouraging folks to consider that. David mentioned it's survival. We truly believe that. We believe this is a matter of survival. We know there's going to be another side to this. We know what there's going to be at the other end of this, and we know that the dynamics of the supply side model are going to change drastically on the other side of this. We also know that we have a responsibility to all of our stakeholders, our team members, most specifically our franchisees, our investors, to have a business for them to come back to. And so we're working really, really hard to make sure that, and I'll let Charlie get into what they're doing, because I'm sure he's got a lot to say as well. But, as we get into this third phase of really, optimizing and beating expectations, that's what this is all about. Understanding where we can best serve the guest, where we can best go beat these downside projections, and put our organizations in a place where on the back end of this crisis, we're in a position to thrive.
All right, so I'm going to pick this up. My name is Charlie Chase. I'm the CEO of a company called First Service Brands. We have about 1,500 franchises, 5 different brands. Everything we do is home improvement. So at the end of the day, what we find in our lives is we have 50% of our locations operating and 50% of our operations are not. They've been shut down totally. At the end of the day, we have different operating maxims that we use, as we have always done. And so I'm just going to break a couple things down. First and foremost, we will always operate within our value set. We have a very set of discrete values, and we hold to them whether we're in a crisis or not. Number 2, we are comparing this crisis to anything that people have been involved with in the past. So some people were running businesses during 9/11 in New York. We're using them as a resource. Some people, most people were running businesses during the Great Recession. So what we're doing is we're comparing how we are attacking this challenge to things that people have done in the past. So we are pulling on their experience, and there's some mental pieces that go together there. And then at the same time, what we have a framework that we use, we call educate, collaborate, and communicate. So we are spending time to educate people, to have them understand the reality. And then we are collaborating with people for their reality. And then we are over communicating by a factor of 10 with respect to what's going on. There are people, as John and Dave said, that are in communities that don't think this is an issue. You may be in Des Moines and you may think that this isn't going to affect you. Well, it may not. But if you're anywhere near the coastlines, or you're if you started in Washington, you were shut down pretty much 2.5, 3 weeks ago. There's another framework we have which we use, and we call it bottom up and top down. And both Dave and John mentioned it. You have The top down is what's the board going to do to support the franchisors, and that's around people and cash. And again, we're operating within our value set, but also we're working on bottom up. What's the front line doing? And we need to move contextually into their shoes to understand what does this mean. And I'll give you an example, and everybody may not like this or the way I'm going to frame this, but this is the reality. 2.5 weeks ago, we had operations that none of the CARES package or none of the support was there, and they needed to use unemployment in the state that they were in to keep their people paid. Now, they may not be eligible now for any support, but they were doing the right thing for their employees at the time because they knew that 3 weeks of no revenue was going to knock them out of the game. We have 1,500 franchises, 150 of which are in startup for us, which is roughly a 2-year startup phase. And they are all like newborns right now. They are really, really fragile. And it's a very difficult thing. So when I draw back and I think of our role, and it's the three of us on the call that you can see, but it's everybody on this call. It's what does leadership stand for in your world? How do you provide the words and the leadership and the guidance that are going to keep people focused? So we came down to 3 words. Everything you notice we do is in 3s, every one of us here. The first one is agility. As David said, this thing changes day to day, every other day to every other day. So agility is number 1. And if you're not sure what agility means, look it up. The second word we focus on is accuracy. We want facts, and we want facts that we can grab a hold of and work with. And generally the facts are history. It's not what's ahead of us. And the last thing we want is transparency. We want nobody to not know what we're thinking or doing, because we know that when people don't know, they make stuff up. So the rumor mill spins at a rate that is right now is breakneck. And every one of our franchise systems has backdoor systems. We have owners associations. We have all these people. So we need to keep everybody very clear. So agility, accuracy, and transparency. And as leaders, that's what we do. And just so we're very clear, words matter. Language is really, really important. And even with our own systems, I've heard phrases such as shut down, close down, things like that. I don't want to use that phrase. The phrase I want you all to grab a hold of is scaling down. You're scaling down, which means you were here, you're coming down the path, and you're going to end up scaling down to a certain level, and then you need to scale back up. And in the middle period, that's where you can think of rest, it's recuperation, or it's retraining, it's retrenching. You can come up with some words there, but at the other end of this thing, you need to scale back up. And if you lose 3 weeks, you're going to need to scale back up over time so that within 5-6 months, you can regain what you've lost. I'm there. I'll hand it back to David.
I think it's a good point, Charlie. I oftentimes say leadership is all about communication, right? And you can think up great plans, but if you can't communicate it to those that are impacted, then that leadership falls apart. And I think in today's world, fear, all of us have fear. I doubt there's a person on this call that doesn't have fear over something relative to this virus. It might be the health of a parent, it might be the health of the community, and it can also be just our financial health and what's going on in our respective businesses. But there's fear. And I would encourage everyone on this call that fear also therefore becomes a restrictor plate almost on people's ability to hear, which then creates the need to over communicate. And I often use the analogy, it's like telling someone when they have cancer. When the doctor says you have cancer, I don't think most people hear much after that. And that's where people are today with fear. And so over communicate. And that's why I also speak about what's the future. You have to have a vision. And I think Charlie and John have each said that in their own respective ways, whether it's we're talking about this downscale, but People don't want to go through the downscale. Your franchisees don't want to go through the downscale. Your personnel don't want to go through the downscale unless there's something at the other end. And I think all out of preservation, many of us have had to focus on the downscale and what that means. And I'm recommending on this Tuesday morning, as we're looking at Congress passing an act that might provide some relief, there's got to come a time with all of our brands about how do we create the vision. It doesn't mean you have to have everything buttoned up, but you got to start communicating the vision. John, don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, you know, our systems, you know, the entire ecosystem of our stakeholders are looking to us for guidance. They're looking to us for confidence. You know, they're looking to us for, you know, to be a path forward. And so I think being able to craft that vision is really important. I do think there's goodness also in having a really well-defined plan that you can articulate where you are against that plan as we get through the triage portion of this, right? So knowing, being able to confidently communicate to your system that this is where we expect to be today and this is where we expect to be tomorrow, and then to be able to follow back up with them and say, this is it, this is where we are today and this is where we are tomorrow and here's the delta. I think there's a lot of goodness in that. And then the other thing I'd add, you know, we all have to take care at the enterprise level. We've got to take care of these businesses, our businesses, quickly and definitively. But then we need to push those tools down very, very quickly to our franchisees who are going through this exact same. They need to go through this exact same exercise. It's kind of like, you know, it's kind of like the warning on an airplane when the oxygen masks drop. Put yours on first, and then help the person next to you, right? And, you know, we've got our oxygen masks on now, and we've got a responsibility very quickly to push these tools down to our franchisees to make sure that they've got their own cash modeling in place, that they're doing their own, you know, runway burn analyses, and that they've got the tools that they need to make good decisions about things like how do you furlough, or do you furlough, or do you lay off, and what are the implications of WARN, and you know, how do I create downside modeling and then go achieve, you know, upside to that downside? It's our responsibility to push all those tools very, very quickly, to deputize our systems, to deputize our FBCs, to deputize our RMs in a corporate environment, even to a certain extent to deputize our franchisee councils, right? To go drive these systems very, very quickly to our franchisees so that they can go through the same process themselves.
Yep. Charlie, anything to add before we hit a few questions?
No, I think you guys have covered it. Let's open it up.
But John, I got to ask you the first question. So you have some sayings behind you. I've read some of them. Why don't you just pick out one and just comment on it for the audience?
Oh, geez. So believe in what you do so deeply that others are inspired to join based simply on that shared belief. And so, you know, I think that's it actually came from a Simon Sinek reading, believe it or not. My first exposure to Start With Why was don't do business with people who want what you have, do business with people who believe what you believe. And so that came out of that. You know, awesome. Believe in what you're doing so deeply that others are inspired to join just based on a simple shared belief.
And I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that. So now we're not able to have the human touch. How are you doing that, what you just spoke of, or within your current role? How do you do that via Zoom or phone calls and really maintain that belief system that has passion to it and not just a bunch of written words?
Well, so I think part of it is something that Charlie mentioned, which is, I think actually you both mentioned, which is just to over communicate. I think it's critical. I mean, like most people on this call, this has been 17-hour days since this all hit, right? And not all of it is like head down work product. A lot of it is just time on the phone or on video calls with people. you know, in the beginning it was, hey, let's talk about what's going on. Let's talk about what we're afraid of. But I think that pretty quickly transitions into, okay, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to go be great at what we're doing about it? And so, you know, some of it's really tough stuff, and some of it's really inspirational stuff. But I think having that direct personal contact is really important. And again, whether you do it via video or whether you do it via just calls, I think the medium is less important than the action, right? I think we're in touch with our portfolio company leaders constantly. I think the thing that I find most lacking right now, and you know, as I try to open my day every morning with a walk just to kind of clear my head. And the thing I was thinking about this morning was, how can we as leaders get out into the field and get in front of our franchisees and our unit level team members and have this same impact? We can't. It's so hard, right? Because we're all stuck where we're stuck. And so I haven't figured that out yet, right? What's the virtual version of a store tour? What's the virtual version of a store walk or a market walk? Because, you know, we're gonna have to figure that out. And maybe it's a webinar like this, or maybe there's different media. But I think as long as that's our true north and we're focused on driving that impact, we'll get there.
I have encouraged teams to use more and more Zoom or GoToMeetings,
Yep.
Just to not lose the human touch. Because I think a lot of us, at least for me, email is just overwhelming at the moment because everybody's sitting in front of their computer and they're just pounding out emails. But as a result, I'm getting 400 a day. I can't keep up. I guess as a result, I'm just encouraging people that we still have to have a human element here. This is truly, franchising is about people.
Yeah.
And we have to make sure we don't lose that. Charlie?
Yeah, the thing that we're doing, and not to be silly about it, and it's John and you, Dave, it's we're reaching out to 4 to 5 people a day that we get pointed to. So our team is calling, and I'm calling franchisees, and in all fairness, the calls are about 1.5 minutes or less. They don't go too far. My communication methodology is a little different if I know the person or know a little bit about them. But we're just communicating safety, checking in on their family, and letting them know that it matters. And if they have an iPhone, I'm going straight to FaceTime. I mean, I apologize for, you know, I actually dressed up for this, but for the last few days, you know, t-shirts are kind of been de rigueur for the last couple of days. And but the reality is, I think everyone appreciates it, and they will remember that. People will remember what you did, the time you took, and it's not hard. That's not hard.
Yep, got to take the extra time. I know a few questions. Charlie and John, I don't know if you see the questions for you. I've only gotten 2 questions.
I don't see any questions. So this is
Yeah,
my
I've
first.
got a different screen up.
David, I'm happy to read the questions off unless you want to manage that, whichever's easier.
Paul, why don't you jump in, throw us questions and direct them wherever you want to, and we'll go around the horn if people have something to add.
You bet. This question's open to all 3 of you. Do the SBA disaster loans have the same asset securing as normal SBA loans? And who determines the amount of the loan? And how do you maintain, and it's more like 3 questions, I apologize. How do you maintain employment of people when it's been many days that they've already been unemployed and in most cases have applied for unemployment?
And so why don't I take this because I'm pretty intimately involved in the bills. Disaster recovery is a typical SBA program that's long been used. It's historically been used for hurricanes, tornadoes, and other events. So most SBA lenders can walk you through that. The critical piece that they're looking at is really your liquidity. And they're trying to understand what are your immediate needs that were created by this disaster. It has nothing to do with employment. It has no restrictions on employment. And you can borrow up to $2 million and there will be personal guarantees. The act that is part of the Rubio-Collins bill, which is part of the CARES Act that's being debated by Congress at the moment, that act will provide for a loan based upon your payroll based upon your rent, your debt service, and your utilities. Whether you're open or closed, there's going to be some fine tuning of that, I'm sure, through the regulatories forthcoming. But that's what the loan's going to be based on. It's really going to be a look back in assessing what that needs to be. That loan will then be provided. It will have no collateral, will be fully unsecured, and no personal guarantees. Subsequent to that, there will be a forgiveness policy based upon your employment this year versus your employment for the same time last year. So let's say you have 80% of the people, or your payroll is 80% of what it was last year, you're going to get 80% of that loan forgiven for an 8-week period. If it's 30%, you're going to get 30% forgiven. I've encouraged people, don't get hung up on how much is forgiven. I would suggest people do the right thing for their business.
How much do you need?
Get the loan, and whatever gets forgiven on the back end.
Yep.
But this, I will go back, you've heard it from Charlie and John, is about survival. So you have to get the liquidity on the front end. And if it's not forgiven, it's a 10-year loan at 3.25% interest, unsecured, no personal guarantee. I would suggest your franchisees need that. I know I'm talking to some franchisors who probably need it as well. Go get it. As soon as it's not out there yet, it will not be out there probably for another week. But it's going to ride on what we call the rails of the 7A program. Charlie has often used this term, we need on-ramps for the government to get from 0 to 60 quickly. So when you mention 7A to a lender who's uninformed, they're going to say, oh, you need more money than a 7A will provide. It's just the 7A system is what they're using. That's the on-ramp. It's actually going to be a different one. There'll be more forthcoming on this from IFA. I would suggest that, Paul, we're probably going to have a webinar on this in a week or so. I'll be glad to lead that, maybe with like a Ron Feldman or Mike Rosman, Ron from Apple Pie, Mike from Bowfly. We have other specialists around who know these programs. We will bring that material to you once it's known. The last point is you can't get both a disaster loan and a CARES Act loan. So you're going to have to assess which is.
Yep.
Okay. John, Paul, go.
Yep. Well, David, you were just able to answer like 3 or 4 questions in that time frame, so thank you. The next question here is, could each speaker address possible litigation arising from this situation? Not necessary if the virus is covered, but by insurance, but if Zors should expect litigation from their franchisees. Who would like to start? Charlie?
Well, we have a lot of lawyers, right? So we employ a lot of lawyers, and if I listened to the lawyers for every business decision I ever made, we would be locked in irons most of the time. This is a series of business decisions, and we go back to our value set, as I said. So we have a set of guiding principles, and we're going to work with them. And if a court of competent jurisdiction 6 months from now or 6 years from now doesn't like a decision we made, so be it. But I think we have things aligned. Franchisees, there are elements of certain things that I think that are happening that franchisees don't like, but it's because they don't fully understand. And there are people that are, so let me give you an example. We have suppliers that are shut down, and the suppliers, without the supplies going to the franchisee is shut down, and then the franchisee is yelling at us saying it's our fault, but the supplier is in a jurisdiction that was shut down. And there's a bit of angst that goes through that, and it's an approved supplier. So then what do you do for another approved supplier? There's a lot of things like that, but and once the dust settles, I think people understand. But right now, and I think John touched on it, this is a health issue driving an economic outcome, and it's a health issue that ranges on a wide piece of geography for the 3 of us, certainly North America, for David, certainly Asia as well. And it has different impacts in different areas, and the amount of information that people are processing really only relates to their world, and they don't understand how other parts of the world are affecting them. Our manufacturing in one part of the country is shut down, and so franchisees will not be able to receive materials, and that is what we would say a cluster. But we're holding to our value set. and we will respond appropriately.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is there are some complexities that are overlapping and are actually causing some sort of inconsistencies in how things can be read. I sat on an hour-long webinar about the impact of COVID-2, particularly around the expansion of FMLA and paid sick leave.
Explain what you mean by that.
So the second bill that was passed, I think it was Families First. Officially, it's called Families First. They're informally referring to it as COVID-2, and it was all around the expansion of emergency FMLA and emergency paid sick leave. And as I sat through the call, the goal for me sitting through was to try to understand it so that we could provide some guidance to our portfolio companies. What struck me was, look, we've got people in our portfolio companies that are experts on this. I'm trying to become an expert at everything overnight. A lot of this stuff that, maybe I have a base foundational knowledge and maybe I don't. But what struck me and what we then decided as a firm is we are going to, in effect, utilize our subject matter experts across the portfolio as best we can. So rather than me trying to become an expert on everything, whether I have a foundational knowledge in it or not, we're going to ask people that already have a functional expertise to become expert in that area and then share that across our portfolio. And so, look, is there going to be potential litigation? Yes. Can we see some of that potential now and maybe not see some of the other potential now? I think that's true. We have no idea what some of the outcomes of this are going to be. But to the extent that you've got subject matter expertise that you can leverage either across your existing businesses or even amongst ourselves at within the network of the IFA, look for those opportunities.
I think enough said on it. Paul, next question.
Wonderful. David, this one is for you. How do you recommend franchisors handle franchisees that are asking for royalties to be waived during this time? You know what other brands are doing with monthly minimums, etc.
Yeah, for those on the call, some of you might know I'm a franchisor as well as a franchisee. I am a franchisee of KFC and Taco Bell, as well as Capriati's, of which I'm also on the board of directors as a franchisor. So look, everybody's taking a different approach. And I would say to franchisors here, first and foremost, I think you got to assess candidly, how does the brand get to the other side? And I say that not lighthearted. I say that because that will then form a discussion with your franchisees. There are franchisees out there, some of which might be closed in certain parts of the country, that dollar is really important to them. And you have to assess, I think the overarching is, yes, you can lean one way, which is completely sympathetic to that. But as a result, to the discussion that we had earlier, you sit down and look at your cash flows. If you gave abatements to everyone, you'd end up with nothing and you'd have no brand. And is that really doing the right thing for all the franchisees as well? And then you have other people that have a robust balance sheet. It was announced yesterday, and I'll say it here, that KFC and Taco Bell announced for every franchisee, they're giving us 60-day grace period. So effectively, April royalties are due in June, but my May is also due in June, right? So, and it's 2 months of 60-day grace, so everybody gets moved back. And then there was a nice paragraph that said, we're doing this for expediency and time, and we recognize many franchisees actually have the capital to pay the royalties, and we would ask that you do so. I happen to be one of those. I have a good balance sheet. I will pay my royalties. I anticipate doing so. That's my way of leaning in that they're doing the right thing for the brand for others. There are very few people that have the balance sheet of a KFC and Taco Bell. And so as I've worked with some of our teams, I guess, and I'm speaking to the franchisors, I've been an advocate of just don't run out and say, hey, just stop paying your rent. stop paying your vendors. Because you know what's the next statement? Stop paying your franchisor. And what I've encouraged instead is, how do you sit down and make good business cases and have that discussion with your landlords? But likewise, how do we sit down as a group, especially on these emerging brands, where literally systems are closed? And how do you sit down and have a conversation with franchisees about, look, we're in this together, and we got to come out the other end. And I want to come out with as many stores open and as many franchisees viable, but we also need a viable brand. And so somehow we're going to have to figure that out and work together. Relative to royalty minimums, I do think I've heard generally when units are absolutely closed, royalty minimums are being waived. And I think that just comes down to a value set. The truth of the matter is, if you look back in the history of franchising, royalty minimums came about because we as franchisors didn't want franchisees sitting on territory and not working the territory. And this was a way of making sure that if they're going to be in, they had to be in. I think it's really difficult to now look at a franchisee and say, you're willing to bust your ass, you were busting your ass, but now because the government put you out of business, you still owe me a minimum. That's a David Barr opinion. But with that, those are my comments. There's no perfect answer here, folks, especially if you're an emerging brand and that next dollar really means something. Charlie kept using values. You got to come back to a value set and just try to figure this out. With that, I'll turn it over to John, and then we'll go to Charlie.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's something we spent a lot of time on in the last week. We are taking a very uniform approach, and I won't get into the details of it, but I'll just say that number one, first and foremost, it comes back to your downside model. What can you afford to do? Remembering that the short-term goal here is to come out of the other side with a brand that your franchisees can still access, right? So refer to your downside model. The second thing is that we've chosen to take a uniform approach from a structure standpoint, but we've created nimbleness, to use Charlie's term, and flexibility within the program so that it can be applied asymmetrically moving forward, right? Just like the initial impact of this is going to be different market to market and brand to brand. The recovery from this is going to be different, completely different from brand to brand and from market to market. So we've created some nimbleness in the program. And then the third thing, I think our third sort of general tenet on this is the recovery. It's not going to be like switching a light. At this point, it doesn't appear like the recovery is going to be like switching a light on. If you look at any of the Wall Street analyst reports that are coming out, it looks like we are heading for a pretty significant recession. Unemployment is gonna spike. Discretionary spending is going to be reduced significantly. And so, even in the best case scenario, if everybody came back on tomorrow from a government mandate standpoint, this recovery is still going to be. It's still going to happen over time. And so we wanted to build enough flexibility into our programs that franchisees could really begin to build their own war chest back up and their own cash position back up. Interestingly enough, upon initial roll, we've got franchisees that are saying thanks, but no thanks. We're good. We're going to do we're going to do our part and lean in and do what we have to do. So great topic. Appreciate the question, Charlie. I'll kick it over to you.
Well, we have a lot of experience in this as a franchisor, and our franchise systems are in good shape as franchisors. Personally, I'm going to speak from personal. I never like getting a handout because there's always a string attached, and the string is generally so long that when someone pulls on it, it could be way down the road and you have unforeseen consequences. So I'm not big into handouts. That's number one. Number two, I feel that if you're a franchisee, you have a banking relationship, go to that banking relationship, because I, as a franchisor, have to go to my banking relationship as well. So I think everyone needs to be respectful of where the sources of cash and capital are right now, and you have to avail yourself of that. Number three, if you're operating and this is not affecting you, you should pay your royalty. Mostly, we think royalty is sacrosanct in the sense that our royalties are across all our systems sub 4%. Therefore, it's not 96% of your business. It's under 4% of your business. And lastly, we all have to come out of this thing in the right way. And we as a franchisor will do whatever it takes to keep franchisees in play. And we, through the Great Recession, we didn't lose many, and that we're really proud of. But I'll go back to how David opened it. You have to start with your value set. You have to start with your culture. You have to start with what makes you tick. If you vary from that, if you sway from what people have been relying on in good times, you'll lose all credibility in bad times.
Excellent. Next question, gentlemen. For many franchisees, rent is due April 1st. Any practical advice on what to do if revenue is substantially down? I've been seeing this question like constantly all the past week and 2 days.
Say that again, Paul, real quick.
I'm sorry. For many franchisees, rent is due April 1st. Any practical advice on what to do if revenue is substantially down?
I'm going to go back. If I'm I'm going to answer it 2 ways. If I'm a franchisee who's asking that question, I'm probably going to take, this is about survival. And I want to Charlie's point, I want to be respectful of where the capital falls, but I also have to have a chance at survival. So if I have not availed myself of other banking relationships or other capital sources, and I can't make that payment and make payroll, especially for people who've already worked, then, you don't pay the rent. If you can pay the rent, you pay the rent. Most importantly, and what I've done in a couple of my businesses, not KFC, not Taco Bell, where we have been shut down by the government. I've already called and written the landlord and said, I've been shut down. I do not plan on paying rent. And I'm not asking for forgiveness at this time. I'm just letting you know from a liquidity standpoint that this is what we're doing. And I'll be glad to talk to you on the back end of this. So that's been my approach. It hasn't been a promise I will pay. It hasn't been a promise I won't pay. It's just said, these are the facts. And so I think that's as a franchisee. As a franchisor, what would I recommend to my franchisees? I'd recommend discussion. Again, I'll go back. I think you get in a slippery slope as a franchisor if you just start saying, don't pay people. You're not party to those contracts. I think you should be respectful of those contracts. And I would promote dialogue. And again, this is a fearful time. It's a fearful time for your landlord too. And I think communication is respectful. Anything to add, John or Charlie?
Nope.
I do. Oh, go ahead, David.
Paul, there's a question that's coming to me that is coming through chat, not questions. So I just want to make sure I answer because I don't know if you're seeing it. It says, if a franchisee does not have a liquidity to continue to operate, how should a franchisor think through evaluating it? Should it provide liquidity to the franchisee, or should it be acquiring the franchisee, or should it let it close? I'm going to let John or Charlie go first on that one.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like, I think, I come back to, again, what does your triage plan allow you to accomplish? Your goal on the back end of this is making sure that you've got an organization that your franchisees can continue to leverage and that your team members can come back to, or continue to thrive in. And, if you're in a position to provide liquidity to a franchisee and you choose to make that decision, the concern I would have about that is setting the precedent and are you then in a position to do that over and over and over again? The question about whether you acquire the unit, unfortunately, I think we're all going to be faced with a fair amount of those decisions, internally, externally, right? The reality is that there's going to be a supply shakeout on the other side of this. And I hope for everybody, us, and everybody else on this call, that we can minimize that. I don't know that right now is necessarily the time to undertake that. Again, go back to what Charlie said earlier. What are your values in your system, and how would your system evaluate you making the decision to pick up units, distressed units in this moment? I don't think it's something we would do, but who knows? As the other reality is we still don't know. We don't have certainty around the length of this. And if we knew that a month from now we were going to be on the other side of this, if we really knew that, or if a stimulus plan was in place that allowed us to have a better understanding of what our potential cash positions look like a month from now, I think it'd be easier to evaluate those decisions. The reality is neither of those things are true today. And as days go by and we gain more certainty around the length of this and when we might come out of it, or what the scale of the relief efforts are going to be, I think we'll be in a better position to make those determinations.
Charlie, anything to add?
Nope.
Hey, Paul, do we have about 4 minutes left?
We have about 4 minutes left, maybe one more question. If you guys want to use that time to maybe do a capstone on today's conversation, I'll leave it up to you, David.
I might do that, and I'll offer up if there's a variety of other questions. Paul, I don't know if you can tell who answered them. I think Charlie, John, and I, assuming there's not hundreds and there's just a few more, would be glad to pop some email answers and/or get on the phone with people. Again, as long as there's not hundreds of them, don't know what's out there.
There's a handful, but we'll download them and I'll share them with you guys.
Okay. I'd just like to make a comment. Having gone through this in China, Charlie mentioned China. I sit on the board of directors of Domino's Pizza China. I've been in China now for 5 years. Last time I was there was December because the virus outbreak was right after that. Everyone keeps saying China's back. And I keep trying to dampen that a little bit. Domino's, we're up in sales in China, but Domino's US is up in sales last week. So that's a unique business model. I would only tell you that Beijing is a city of over 20 million people. As of we sit here at this moment, it has 21 cases of the virus. And we have 60 dining rooms closed in Beijing. That country is different. They can literally shut things down, and they have. I think we're seeing now a public debate starting about health versus economic health. And that really kind of got kicked off yesterday with what's going to happen from a federal government after the 15 days that Trump had started, and we're now 8 days through it. And I would only suggest to you, there's the government policy, but there's also your consumer or your customer. And I'm saying this oftentimes to restaurants, salons, gyms that have literally been shut down. Even if the government said tomorrow, you can reopen, I think you have to ask yourself, does the consumer come flying back? I would say no. And this is why I'm telling people, as you assess your plans, be honest with yourselves about that. It's easy to blame the government and say, the government, as soon as they turn this on, I'm back in business. I would suggest many restaurants will not see a full helping of customers until this is off the nightly news about how many people are dying. And so none of us have a crystal ball, but I'm going to suggest to you that's longer than a week. It's longer than a month. And that's why I'm encouraging people really have plans to get to August, September with your liquidity. Because I'd rather be wrong on that end than telling people just get through the next 2 weeks. So I want to make sure you hear, at least from some people with either gray hair or no hair, that you need to think about this very strategically and think out. And I'm speaking to the emerging franchisors. Let's be careful. You have an opportunity to really show leadership here and be thoughtful as you think through that. I'll leave with John, and then Charlie can have our closing comments.
Yeah, I think just from a closing comment standpoint, I think thinking about the future and coming out the other side of this, it's easy to jump to conclusions about what's going to change, right? And I think it's easy to foresee that there's going to be some changes moving forward. What is social distancing going to become a norm? We don't know. The only corollary, or the most recent corollary I think we have for this sort of black swan event is 9/11, because it truly came out of nowhere. And as you think about 9/11, you think about the lasting impact, the lasting societal or structural impact. In the days after, the thought was, there's this sort of resurgence of, community and a resurgence of the American pride, and that was going to exist moving forward. And there was also sort of the fear around, there was a real fear around, the targeting of minority populations and, particularly people that came from that part of the world. But if you look back on today, 20 years later, the real legacy of that event was something completely different, right? Our willingness to forgo privacy and significant aspects of privacy in order to get on an airplane, is the real sort of lasting legacy of that. And if you had, in the days after, or the months after, even the year after 9/11, you would not have thought that, right? And so I guess my counsel, the way we're thinking about it, the way I'm thinking about it, the way I'm talking to my kids about it is, we'll get through this, right? And we need to not jump to conclusions about what the lasting impact of this is going to be from a societal standpoint, because we won't know that for years, right? What's really important is that we focus on what we do know, and what we can do about what we do know in the moment.
Charlie?
Well, that was powerful, John. Well done. I'm going to go back. I think I was asked a question. I'm going to try and wrap it in as a close. We've been talking an awful lot about top-down here with the franchisor world and our boards and our banks, and then a little bit about franchisees. But when I said we're working from bottom up, we're actually trying to put ourselves in the shoes of our frontline workers. We're trying to understand exactly where what's going on in their lives, and what we're trying to do is get them liquidity as quick as possible. And as I said earlier, the path to that was relying on the states and the provinces with their big pools of unemployment. That may be a bad decision, but where the decision had to be made in some environments right away, because this thing, if you back up 2 weeks, it was in Kirkland, Washington. Everybody on this call, you need to not just think of the franchisee, you need to think of how to over communicate and stay engaged with the frontline workers. There will be an awful lot of movement of frontline workers out of your businesses if you don't do that. And that's why the phone calls you make and things, you've got to be able to reach in and encourage your franchisees to not forget about their people. Because right now, we're all worried about ourselves. We're worried about franchisors, but our franchisees need to be worried about their frontline workers. So in our world, we have 20,000 frontline workers. We do $2.4 billion worth of work, and we have 1,500 franchises. And I'll tell you, it's taking up every waking moment of every day in all of our teams. That's it for me.
Thank you all for being on the call. Paul, we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Excellent webinar. A lot of great questions. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. As always, I want to remind everyone, IFA is standing here with you. The franchise family is here with you. You're not going about this alone. We are here to help. We will all get through this together. And rest assured, everyone, IFA is here for you. I also want to remind everybody that tonight is the Great American Takeout. So please go support your local franchised restaurant, and they could all use the help. So on that note, thank you, everybody. Thanks, guys. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks,
Bye, guys.
Paul.
Thank you.